Assalamu alaikum viewers, a very warm welcome to all of you watching Hidayat TV. I'm Haider with another episode of Generation Gap. Shafila Ahmed, a bright student as described by her teacher who wanted to become a barrister. She was 17 in September 2003 when she was reported missing. She was not reported missing by any of her family. It was her teacher after a week when she didn't attend school. Few months later, in February 2004, her remains were found on the bank of River Kent in Cumbria. Her parents, Iftikhar 52 and Farzana 49, initially denied any involvement in her murder, but after almost 9 years, in August 2012, they both were found guilty by a jury at Chester Crown Court. It was the most highlighted and prolific case in the modern times in the name of honor killings. However, it all started with a summer trip to Pakistan in 2003. Shafila traveled to Pakistan where she was introduced to an arranged marriage proposal. She swallowed bleach, badly scarring her throat, an injury which required constant medical attention when she returned home. Justice Roderick Evans told Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed, quote, "Your concern about being shamed in your community was greater than the love of your child. You choose to bring up your family in Warrington, but although you lived in Warrington, your social and cultural attitudes were those of rural Pakistan, and it was those which you imposed upon your children." Viewers, it was an unfortunate incident and must be condemned in all aspects. However, this was the case which started from a debate between arranged and forced marriage. This tragic event raised many questions regarding our social values and cultural norms. Today, inshallah, we will be talking about forced marriages and will try to understand more about this issue. To discuss all this, we are joined in the studio. Sophia Begum is a community activist, and she has done her thesis at the University of Manchester, whether the liberal state should regulate the private sphere on that. And sitting next to her is Aisha Iqbal. She's also a community activist. And also over the phone, we're joined by Iram Ramzan. Assalamu alaikum, Iram.
Alaikum salam, you okay?
Yeah, you're good. Iram is a freelance journalist, a social affair reporter for Menkwin Matters, and a writer for Prior. She also writes for Digital Journal, Asian Media and Revival magazine. Iram, let me start with you. Define us this notion of forced marriage for us, please.
Well, it's where someone is coerced into marrying someone they've not really given their consent to. And in many cases, sometimes, I think the stereotype is that there's a lot of physical violence associated with it, but often it's a lot of emotional blackmail and social pressure that leads to it, rather than physical violence. And usually emotional blackmail does tear a person down quicker, and so what you'll have is someone eventually caves in and in that sense consent, even though deep down they don't really want to go through with it.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned coerced with these, but what's the difference between arranged marriage and forced marriage? There's a very small, thin line between that.
It really depends. In certain cultures, men and women can't really mix together and meet and find partners for each other, although I suppose it is changing now in some countries, but in many cultures today, you don't really have that option. So parents will find you someone, and children then they accept it and think, okay, yes, that's fine. Whereas in a forced marriage, you might get that, but they're told you don't have a choice, because if you don't go through it, how will I show my face to the community if you refuse this person? So it might be the same stages in that sense, but there's very little choice given in a forced marriage, hence the term. So there's nothing really wrong with an arranged marriage, providing that two parties consent and are happy with that.
So consent is important. Okay, let me bring in Sophia here. Sophia, what's your view on it? do you think there is a very small difference between arranged marriage and forced marriage, or?
I think you have to be careful that we don't put them in the same bag. Arranged marriage is, consent is required, where the woman or the actually the man in this case, we don't want to associate it just with the woman, has a right to say yes or no to the suitor, whether they want to marry them. Whereas forced marriage is very much a pressure. It could be emotional, it could be physical. It's to get that child to marry someone that they may not want to marry, or actually they don't want to marry. So I think there is a major difference between the two.
Okay, your take, Aisha?
I think with arranged marriage, you have to remember that it's not just about the family, it's about somebody involved in making a decision or supporting your decision. So for example, if a friend was to introduce you to an individual, that would be a form of arranged marriage, because they have arranged for you to meet someone that, you know, you were not in complete control because you needed their assistance. Similarly, we tend to focus on arranged marriages so much as in what parents do, but we use, for example, dating websites or single Muslims or all these websites. There's somebody else, a third person, who's trying to match you up depending on your criteria with another person. So it's not as simple as arranged marriage as a parent sitting together and that's about it. There's so many different ways of looking at it. And with each one of those ways, what you find is that regardless of whoever brought the proposal forward, ultimately the decision lies with the individual.
So there has to be consent, as
there has to be consent, but it's also, it's not, when you said it's a fine line, it's not a fine line, because there's a happiness and there's a consent behind it. And it's the emotions that are involved.
Iram, tell us, is it a more sort of cultural sensitive issue for all of us? I mean, there is so much narrative in the media regarding what I was mentioning regarding this arranged and forced marriage. So people don't understand the difference. So is it a cultural sensitive which is only stemming from the immigrant communities in this country, or what's your view on it?
I think we need to remember that arranged marriage, when we talk about arranged marriage, we talk about the traditional way that marriages were set up, and we're forgetting, you know, maybe a few decades ago, that is how people would be set up to be married. Their parents or their communities will find somebody for them. Obviously now that's changing a little bit. But I think a lot of Asian people or Muslim people, sometimes we do get very defensive when these issues are talked about, because then we think the whole community is being maligned. We think the religion is being dragged into it. And then sometimes we don't want to talk about it. So we bury our head in the sand and say, oh no, this has nothing to do with us. We don't do this. So why do we always have to defend ourselves? But it needs to be talked about, because it still happens even to this very day. You know, I came across two girls when I was in Pakistan who were pretty much being forced into getting married. So it does still happen.
Yeah, we are not running away from it, but why it has been associated only with and as you mentioned rightly, that this Islamic narrative has been used as well, that it is, God forbidden, is allowed in Islam.
I don't think I've ever heard it being said it's an Islamic thing, but I think many people think it's more of a South Asian problem, because we feature in the statistics heavily, and that's because there are more of us here in this country. So because there are more Asians, so if there are cases of forced marriages, you know, the numbers are going to be quite disproportionate in that sense. But it's not just a South Asian phenomenon, it happens in many other countries. It apparently happens in European countries too, with 10% of forced marriages in Europe happening in Ukraine, and another 10% in Turkey as well, and another 10% in Georgia. So it does happen across the world. It's just in our country, we South Asians feature more in the statistics because there are more of us.
Okay, all right. Just stay with us, Iram. What's your take? I mean, is it our issue only, or is...
No. As Iram said, it's something that's a global issue. Forced marriage and child marriages take place and are very prevalent in Latin America, very prevalent in the Horn of Africa and in other certain countries of Africa. So it's not something that is specific to one community or one region. And as Iram said, it's because as an immigrant community, we are a majority from South Asia present, and therefore when you have an immigrant community, with it comes its benefits and also some of the issues as well, in which are manifested and obviously seen.
Okay, and your view?
I'd say the same. Certain migration has come from South Asian countries, and they have both these issues with them, but I wouldn't say it's just South Asian. It's going on different parts of the world, so but obviously that should not take the issue away that it is happening, and we should move forward to tackling it. So.
Okay, moving on from there, Aram, tell us, I mean, if we don't address this issue and if we start living in denial, what are the repercussions? What will happen eventually?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, look what's happening now. I think it's great that the government are taking steps to bring this into legislation, even though a lot of activists and groups believe that most of this will go underground if you legislate it because people won't come forward. But at the same time, you know, we can't really win. When this wasn't being put into legislation, then people complained again, oh, you need to do something about this, we need to make a law. And now they're thinking of making a law, and now people are still complaining again, oh, this won't solve anything. But it is certainly a step in the right direction. At least with a law in place, you have this sense of redress. Victims, even if they don't come forward at first, it will take some time. But at least if something does happen, then victims can go to the police and have this sense of redress and find someone being prosecuted for putting them through that.
I mean, you mentioned this. They are trying to make. I mean, Prime Minister announced on 7th June to criminalize forced marriages. What has been done so far?
Well, the topic is going to be raised again. I think they were saying in April or May. They will start discussing this again, and they're going to think of what kind of maximum sentence they will serve for someone who's been found to forced to marry off their child. So that's as far as I'm aware, those are the steps that they are taking. Okay,
all right. Let me get some stats here. I mean. Obviously, honor, as I mentioned in the stories as well, that there are, since 2010, there are 234 cases which involve the honor. Honor attacks in year 2011, 2,823. And this forced marriage unit set up by Home Office advised 1485 cases in 2011. I want to bring in this, I mean, I was shocked to read this. There were 250 children involved in that. So what's your take on that?
I mean, it's really disgusting to hear when you find out that children are involved. And I can't believe we're still living in a world where females are still seen as possessions of the family, and they have this burden placed on them of the entire community and family's shame and honor. I mean, it's preposterous that we're still living in a day and age like this. I thought we would have moved on by now, but clearly not. How can a child get married? A child is too young to give consent.
And I sorry to interrupt you here. And there was a child whose age was 2. Yes.
I mean, when I read that, I thought that had to be satire or something. I mean, a two-year-old. I'm sorry, but words even fail me. I can't even respond to something like that.
It's appalling, yes, indeed. Okay. The oldest victim was 71 in those cases. So, I mean, where we are heading as a community?
I think what we need to understand is the psychology behind why it happens, and understand what are the cultural contributors, but also the family contributors. Historically, we live in a society, in terms of the South Asian community, where children are told to be very obedient and compliant to their parents. Now, if you've lived a life of obedience with your parents will not see as an issue or anything abnormal for them to tell you who you will marry, because often parents will be involved in the most minutest of decisions. So whether it's to do with what you wear, what you eat, to where you study, what course you do, what degree you do, what university you go to, what kind of friends you have. So if you can see the mentality, it's not very at odds when you've had so much control over your children to then decide who they will marry. And this is where you get the issue, because children are often very compliant because, you know, they want to keep their parents happy. But when it comes to them being bound to another person who they will have to live the rest of their lives, and they obviously protest at that. That's where the issue of the honour, the disobedience, the shame comes into play, because for so long they've done exactly what the parents have said, and all of a sudden they're behaving at odds. And you know, and some people, some parents cannot take that very well, and unfortunately within our community we don't understand that once you become an adult, you should treat a child who's become an adult as an adult as well. They may be your children, even when you're 90 they will still be your children, but they are adults, and they have to be treated with respect, and their views have to be heard and listened to.
Okay, Sophia, tell us, you know, when you talk about this, I mean, I just enlighten me with this very notion of honor. I mean, what exactly it is in our community?
I think honor crime is where they feel like somebody has taken a step forward to bring shame on the family, and it's mostly, I think, associated with who they choose to marry, or if that's where it comes around. I feel honor crime is them going forward, taking steps forward that they deem that the child should not. And they will bring shame to them. It's more about what will people think. That's what I found with honor crimes. It stems from what will people think, and it's like a patriarchal thing, honor. So in the cases that you discussed with, I think it was Banaz.
Yeah,
again,
Banaz
it was
case.
the uncle and father that stepped in. It was you didn't see the mother involved there. It was the uncle and father that stepped in, and something brutal was done just because they felt like she stepped out of line and she should have obeyed them. So her choice
And I think
wasn't there in the matter.
what I would add is that it's what you as a family project to the wider society. So it's not something that's very quantifiable. You know, honor is how you it can be your wealth, it can be your social status, it can be your caste, it can be the job that you do, the degree that you have. It's all about how it positively reflects you and your family to other people, and it's very precious, because it gives you social standing and it gives you respect in return. And a lot of the time honour is also based on the conduct of individuals within the family, and therefore it tends to rest on girls, because girls' honour and their purity is deemed as respectful. So if a girl is tarnished, the honour of that family is tarnished, whereas unfortunately that doesn't happen with boys. They tend to have a lot more leniency in terms of their behaviour, and which is why girls tend to suffer from honour killings and forced marriage a lot more than boys.
Okay, Iram, I just want to bring in here, we're talking about now having two different set of life for girl and boys. I mean, in the case of Shafila, I was reading it that his father was married in Denmark, I believe, and then he enjoyed his life, and all of a sudden then everything came to his mind, and they murdered their own child. So how do you take it?
The ironic thing was, you know, before he married Shafila's mom, he was doing everything that he disapproved of. He was going out drinking and clubbing, and he was being a white woman as well. Everything that he would disapprove of his own daughter doing, but of course he wouldn't allow his own children to do that. You know, it's do as I say and not as I do. Completely hypocritical. It's one rule for the men in the families, and it's a different rule for the women.
So is it more to do with the education, or is it just the preconceived notion of our own beliefs that women don't have the equal rights?
It shouldn't be about education. You do find education is very liberating for women, you know, because what you find is in many of these cases where girls are forced to marry, and especially marry when they're very young, they're of a certain age where they've not managed to complete that education, and they're very vulnerable, and they don't know what's what. They don't know what their rights are. They're just married off, and they're once again someone else's property. First they were there under their father's thumb, and then it's under their husband's thumb. So it should be all about educating the women. You know, the saying is, if you educate a woman, it's as if you've educated a whole generation, and it's true.
So, I mean, but you know, I mean, I've read this story about Dr. Abedin, a Bengali from a learned family, and she was rescued in Dhaka in 2008 by the FMU. So, I mean, they were educated family as well. So, I mean, and it's very difficult for me to understand that why the community and all these sort of that what people think will come along and then they have.
It depends. In some communities, they're very, very insular looking. You might find that, okay, fair enough, they've been to university, they've got a degree, they're professionals, but because they live in that tight-knit community, what other people think and what other people say, it still matters. And you'll find that they care more about reputation and honor than the welfare of their child or even their own welfare. So it is to do with that insular community, like I said. Even if you are educated, if you live in a community like that, it impacts on you. You're a product of your environment, after all.
Okay. Last question. I know you got a tight schedule and you just joined us. How can we tackle this emotional blackmail stuff, you know, from the parents, from the community, from the families?
It's hard to say because if you tackle something emotionally, it goes into your psyche, doesn't it? So it's difficult to deal with. But I think, first of all, the legislation is very important, the fact that they're thinking of making it into a law, because their victims will have a sense of redress. Second of all, I think all organizations and groups should tackle this together. So schools, social services, organizations, Crown Prosecution Service, we should all put funding into this so that whenever issues do arise, because the thing is our communities are very, like I said, we're very tight-knit, so without our families we feel that we are nothing without them. So at least the victims have all these support groups and networks, then I think, in my opinion, that maybe that would help the situation more. At least they'll feel there's someone out there who will help, who actually cares about them.
Okay, let me put you this again. You know, you mentioned this in one of your articles as well, that one of your friends, she was forced into a marriage against her will, and she was basically, her mother told her that if she didn't marry this boy, then she would kill herself, and so she obliged.
Yeah,
so it's not the sort of pressure on the girl itself, it's different kind of. So how she is doing, I would love to know that.
Sorry?
I said how she is doing now when she obliged and she was forcefully wed.
Oh, well, she's separated from him now. It didn't work out because, okay, fair enough, she married him for her parents' sake, but she wasn't happy with him, and she tried for the sake of her parents' happiness, but it just wouldn't work. So you find that while the child might agree temporarily, it just doesn't work because you have to be happy within yourself as well. You can't do it for somebody else. You have to do it for yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Erin, for joining us.
No problem.
Definitely will be in touch with you. Coming back to this point, I mean, once a marriage has taken place, and I want to know that, especially in these forced marriages, what are the consequences? Have you met anyone who's been successful in those marriages, or have they tried to work?
It's unfortunate, actually. If we all look deep, we know a few people that have been gone through, and even I have known where a girl has suddenly gone missing, and then you find out a few years down the line that she was taken, back home and got married. I think there's one tragic case that I know is where the parents got the girl married at the age of 16, and they felt like she was becoming too westernized, was the notion. They married her, and in a way, it's sad because it was a consent, and then marital rape is involved. That's another issue that's come up. If it's not consent, if anything goes on, it is rape. She came back to the UK, and then at that point, she ran away. That led to a path of her going downhill, and they finally tried to make up with her. So she didn't have to live with a guy. He remarried, but her life, the shame in our communities, her life,
she can't interact with the same community again.
Her life is ruined at the age of 16. Now she will always be a divorcee, and that stigma has stuck to her. throughout her life that she didn't make it work. Ultimately, nobody looked at seeing it as a parent's fault. It was her fault, she never made it work, and that's always going to be attached to her being a divorcee. Now for her, in our community, to get remarried,
it's very difficult.
It's very difficult.
Okay,
So.
tell us, she just mentioned that these consequences and those. So what sort of support is available for these women in the community, or not in the community, something from the councils or policy-making institutions?
I think when we talk about support, we have to talk about how many people first seek help. Most people put up with what they are having to suffer. Most people will just remain silent because the stigma of taking your husband or your wife, whoever's assaulting or abusing you, to an authority is for some people beyond what they can cope with. And you also have to remember that forced marriage, you know, that may have taken place, but then the marriage after that and the independence or the ability of the people who've been forced has to be also looked into. Many people who have been forced into marriage may have other issues such as domestic violence to deal with, emotional violence, sexual violence. This has a knock-on effect on their confidence. They may not be allowed to work. They may, you know, in the case of women, they may be subjected to staying at home and taking care of the chores and having very limited freedom. These kind of things cut you off from society. They cut you off from the support net.
The most children, they suffer.
Children suffer, yeah, absolutely, and many children will suffer subconsciously, which will then manifest themselves in later life. When you know, then when it comes to marriage for them, there'll be a lot of fear and a lot of baggage to deal with. There is support out there in terms of if there's violence, then the police are the way you should be going. They have special forced marriage units or domestic violence units within police where they're sensitive to the issue, and domestic violence happens across the board. It's not specific to any community, and therefore they tend to know how to deal with it.
One of the consequences of forced marriages,
yes, absolutely.
It is. Okay, I want to move on to this policy-making institutions now. You have done your thesis whether the liberal state should be regularizing these sort of, private sphere. So tell us the role of state in this. How they can regulate?
I think my thesis generally is looking at normally what's happened in history. The private sphere was seen something that you don't go near. It's happened before, even with domestic violence. You thought that's not our business. That's what goes on in the private sphere is not our business. Then over a period of time, if the whole issue happened where women came out, started to talk about the injustice that are going on with the private sphere, that it became important that if the state is, liberal state is granting equality to both men and women, they will have to go beyond the public, go into the private sphere. And my thesis looked at, so what are those issues that mean that the liberal state should go in? Domestic violence was one of them, forced marriage, all these issues came up, and it was because if they don't go in already, they've allowed inequality to flourish when the whole point of a liberal state is to grant you equality, and that cycle of abuse the inequality is set in the private sphere. If you don't sort that out, it manifests outside. So if you don't sort out gender relations within the private sphere, you'll see, even now you'll see outside sexualization of women, violence against women. It's happening out, sexual harassment.
But some liberal thinkers, they believe that this is a compromise on their own private liberty.
Privacy is different, but when it's harming your internal minorities, it is a state's responsibility to go in and make sure that they are protecting those internal minorities. So then they have to look at what do they mean by granting us formal equalities if they're not allowing them to be enforced. So privacy can still be, what do you mean by privacy? Are they just going in randomly? No, if there's an issue like now somebody's reported that they've been sexually abused or violence has gone on, then I think it's very horrendous knowing that the state would not take responsibility to go in and do something about it.
You know, as a human being, if you've been blessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with intellect, that don't you think religion does not regulate as state regulates the marriage, because there are 70% of Muslim marriages are not registered in the UK. That's another one of the stats as well. And so what do you think, why state has to, what's your view on it, why state has to regulate?
A criminal offence is a criminal offence. and it's a responsibility of the state to deal with a criminal offence. Now, whether it's within the family, it's out on the street, it's in a shop, it's in an office, wherever it is, whoever's committed an offence has to be reprimanded and punished. Privacy and the infringement of privacy is where it's excessive. You know, they're managing your behaviour, they're telling you how you should feed your children. But when it comes to something where the family is taking away the rights of another person, then the state has entitlement to protect that person because that's their role. So it's very, very important. And like Sophia mentioned, there were cases with regard to domestic violence and also rape within marriage. These were unheard of to have those as policies. And when they were introduced and they were discussed, there was a great uproar, and people said that, you know, this is not something where the state should be involved in. But having hindsight, 15, 20 years on, however many it's been, you've seen an attitude change within people where they now recognize domestic violence.
I mean, that's why I mentioned and asked you the question as well, that having the intellect from Allah, and you should have the capacity to respect others, and does not it go with every human?
Absolutely, but we have a moral code of conduct within our faith. But that doesn't mean that the person is obliged to follow that moral code of conduct. And many people tend to use their faith to assert themselves and their rights over others, and are neglectful of the rights of others over them. And so intellect is very important. And before you spoke about education and how, you know, if you're educated, it means that you can tackle these issues. Education is not the key. Education doesn't make you much more spiritual, much more harmonious and caring individual. The issue is with our mentality in dealing with not rights, but equality of value between men and women. At the moment, society does not equally value men and women. And until that happens, you will have these concerns, you will have these issues, because one will be seen as superior and have more rights over the other.
Okay. Now, let me bring in religion here. What is your understanding of Islam? That what Islam tells us about these forced marriages?
Islam says that you have consent. It goes back to that, but it's what Aisha's saying. We know these things, but I think it's very careful. This is not about people doing it because it's an Islamic thing. It's a cultural thing. It's a cultural practice, cultural mentality. What we also tend to find in our communities, we pick and choose. So we may value something more higher than something else. So if you know, there's a lot of things that the Prophet ﷺ did where the men will not see as something a man should do, where the Prophet was always about emancipating women. He was the champion of let's emancipate women, look after them. His last sermon was on make sure you are kind, look after the women. I just feel not more is done to highlight those points, even in mosques now. I mean, hopefully, inshallah, we'll catch on. Most of the stuff is about, okay, your salat, you know, pray, do this, but a big elephant in the room is not discussed, and that's women. And we are.
So are we just denying the fact that there is an elephant in the room?
I think going back to the beginning of the conversation, we spoke about stigma of the community and being on the back foot and defensive, and this is exactly the same case here. Most people feel that it doesn't happen to them, so why should they have to talk about it and discuss such a horrid issue? But unfortunately, it is common, and the other issue is that we don't actually recognise what forced marriage sometimes looks like. We often tend to think of forced marriage as someone kicking and screaming, being put on a plane, or, you know, there's some kind of physical aspect to it, but much of it is emotional. It's years and years of badgering. The
emotional scars.
It's not the scars, it's the way it's done, which then normalizes into your daily routine. So, for example, if your mother and father every single day are saying, why don't you think about it better? Why don't you think about it? Why don't you think about it? After a month, after a year, they will wear you down until the point where you give up. And so, because this is not very physical, it's not in your face, this approach, for many people it's become normal. It's like, oh yeah, my mum was bugging me again. You know, they'll talk to their friends about it, but they themselves won't recognize it. I work with Muslim Scout group, and we spoke about forced marriage, and every one of them was in complete agreement that it was something wrong. However, when it came to identifying what forced marriage was and how it manifests itself, most of them only recognise the physical, the brutal, the very obvious form of forced marriage. They didn't unfortunately recognise that this can be years of prolonged mental torture, drainage, and therefore most people will fall down that route. I mean, we know many people who, by the time they've married, they're kind of shrugging their shoulders, thinking, yeah, my mum, you know, this rishta came about 2-3 years ago and I said no, but you know, I've come round to the idea. That's because they've been worked on it, and you know, pressurized and emotionally blackmailed to the point where they themselves have made themselves believe that this is the right thing to do. And so
there's a continuous effort going on from the community, from the family.
Yeah, and I also think that sometimes parents, they don't do it out of some kind of evilness. Parents just sometimes don't realize the pressures that they put on their children. Because they're so used to governing their children and being in the position of leadership, they forget what it's like to be controlled and to be at service of your parents. And so many of them need to understand and recognize the pressures that they put on their children, because ultimately, if we go back to Islam, if you bring up your children and you enable them to marry and be happy within those marriages, you are guaranteed Jannah. That's been guaranteed.
I mean, there's no question about it that Islam nullifies these sort of marriages straight away.
Absolutely.
I mean, I just don't understand the very concept of these where there's no consent involved. But we have identified the stakeholders. I mean, there is state responsibility, there's religious angle to it. There's a now parental or governing structure which is involved in an umbrella form from the whole community. But how do you tackle it? What is the best way forward for the families?
I think, first of all, programs like these, there needs to be a discussion about forced marriage, but not in a way which is very accusatory and very offensive. It needs to be done where people are actually given the olive branch to say, look, this may be the way things have been, but it's not right. You need to recognize that it's not right and move on from it. There has to be a holistic approach. The legislation side, I think, is very important because it forces people on a tertiary level to change their attitude or to think twice before they do what they do out of fear of, you know, convictions. But then on a community level, there needs to be a real disgust around forced marriages. You know, why is it that we feel disgusted by child abuse? Why is it that we feel disgusted by paedophilia? Why is it that we don't like drugs and we don't like all these criminal behaviour, but yet we allow something which completely destroys two people's lives. The person who's forced to marry, and the other person who's come into that marriage and their partner just you know does not want to be with them. Yeah, I mean, in the case of
Shafila as well as Banaz, the whole family, the community was involved. Banaz's cousins came and then they ran away to Iraq after that. Okay, I mean, in terms of these Home Office proposals or criminalizing this, I want to ask you, Sophia, that I mean, there are two angles to it. Is there any child who want their parents to be behind the bars, or is it a sort of threat?
I think children would find it very, no matter what's going on, I think you're always loyal to your parents, really. You find it very hard to speak out, say that my family's doing this. But having a voice there saying, listen, we will not tolerate this, and there's a legislation in place for those children that do want the benefits of someone looking after this issue, it's still important to have it there. But I think people would struggle.
It's very difficult to come up and seek support and
because they're dependent on the family as well. Where see that it comes to another issue. Where do they go? So if they do reach out, tell the police, so where's their life now? And that's where the other side comes into it. So if they do decide to leave that home, what will happen to them next? Do they have housing? Do they have benefits?
Yeah, in terms of, I mean, Shafila, that is another thing, while seeking support, Shafila approached twice for separate residence, emergency residence, and she was denied. And so social services.
Yeah.
In the case of Banaz, she reported to police 3 times and she still got murdered. So they're not playing their part as well.
I think there needs to be upskilling and cultural sensitivity training when it comes to services such as social services, the police. Everyone has a role to play in protecting other individuals that are under their care. It's unfortunate that with both those cases that they were turned away, which is why the cases came about. There are also cases where the social services and police have intervened and have saved lives, but being as it is in media, we only look at the case, we only go for the worst case scenarios. Definitely legislation is very important, if anything as a deterrent. It's that saying about having, they say, you know, in terms of disciplining children, that you don't use it but you keep a whip or something on your wall just as a reminder that it's there. So that effect of a deterrent is that, you know, we know that, you know, there's a law.
So it's more sort of deterrence you're suggesting?
I think it's more a deterrent. And the fact that there have been convictions is also going to send messages. You don't need to have convictions left, right and centre to deter people. You need to be able to show that a law is working.
I mean, in the case of Alicia as well, Alicia was the final piece, you know,
Her sister,
Shafila's sister. But Mavish stood up for parents.
Yeah.
So she defended parents. So, I mean,
children will defend their parents because children love their parents. You know what?
So that's my question. How will you regulate through these criminal procedures if there is a criminal law in place regarding forced marriages?
There's only so much you can do in terms of legislation. You can't go into every single home and, you know, say, look, if you've got some issues, let us know. Victims have to be brave to come forward as well, and they will only come forward when they feel that society is supportive of them. Now, Alicia obviously exposed her parents' crimes, where her sister Mavish protected her parents because she's obviously she's thinking about the honour of the family, her parents coming into disrepute, you know, everything she's thinking about. And maybe she's also in denial. Many people cope with trauma through denial, through compartmentalization of their issues, and they just lock it up and pretend it never happened. And this is a case with rape victims, with victims of bullying. They tend to not deal with that issue because it's better to pretend it didn't happen.
Okay. Moving on from there, I mean, do you think, Sophia, that the very nature of this whole forced marriage is more to do with demeaning women, especially in particular, or is this a sexist approach we have in the overall society, regardless of Islam or religion? Is overall it is more demeaning towards women?
What I've come across is mostly women that have been forced, but I also want to point out a lot of men do also. I've had cases also, you know, where I've known 2 brothers that were taken back to Pakistan and they were forced to marry women that they did not want to marry. They had came back, it didn't work out, both ended up divorced. So I don't understand what's the point of putting people through that. But it does play, I think, major affects women more, plays a major disempowering role. Not to take away from men, but I do feel it is more towards women. Towards women. Yeah, I feel I don't deny it doesn't happen to men.
I can read the stats for you. More than 80% of the victims in those 1,485 cases, they were female.
Yeah.
And out of that stats, I can also.
And it comes back to
47% involved within the Pakistani community of those.
Well, when you look at these statistics, it shows you the victim was female, but then these victims had parents, and one part of the parent was a mother, so she was female. So it's not as if to say that it's something that's perpetrated by men, only men. It's a combined effort by parents and their mentality. However, having said that, if you look across the world, it is a very patriarchal society and it's manifested itself in various ways. It's very much more overt from South Asian community. You know, forced marriage is very overt. You know, it's done. you can see, you can quantify it.
And most of the cases, I would say, are not even reported.
Absolutely.
They are
Whereas,
accepted.
you know,
by the
suppression
bride
of
or the
women,
groom.
you see in different forms. In the Western Hemisphere, we see it in the form of the sexualization and the objectification of women. And if people are in any denial about that, then that's fine, but that's how we see it. So it's different manifestations of oppression, and it is the case that, like I said before, there is no equal value of men and women, and that is something that is within patriarchal
So how can
society.
we empower the women, particularly regarding to forced marriages cases? We'll talk about we have talked about support as well, but particularly women who are not even gone to universities, because they get married around the age of 16, 17 in these cases. So how can
many channels. I mean, I think there's not one. We have to understand that there's not one way for this. There's got to be a lot of things happening on all levels to make this work. Multi agencies will come together, play their part on social services level. Schools have to play a major part, because let's think about it. This is a South Asian background. Your first target also could be going into those schools and
well, I was reading this that there was one charity who tried to put the posters in the school, and the head teacher, she removed the posters because she says it's a very cultural sensitive issue, so we don't want to promote it in the school.
But then again, you can deliver a workshop in so many ways. You know how workshops going to talk about domestic violence? In that you can incorporate forms of abuse, so emotional, what is abuse, how the powerful oppresses the subordinate. It's how you go. There's so many ways of going. I mean, I'm sure schools can use their creative minds. They're there for a reason to come, how they're going to educate and how they're going to empower the pupils. If they don't have the solutions to do that, then I worry about why they are there in that position if they don't know how to empower their children.
Okay. I mean, your thoughts. I mean, how it's incredible. We all agree it's a complex issue. It's an incredibly complex problem. What is your thought that how we can tackle it?
I think the solution, in terms of the Pakistani community, the Bangladeshi, and any other Muslim community that's affected by it, is faith. Islam is the only thing that's going to pull people out of this hole.
Do we understand Islam?
Well, this is why.
As you mentioned earlier,
this is
we
why.
just pick and choose things.
But this is why I've said at the moment it's not understood. Faith is not understood. It's not accessible to young people. Mosques are not catering for young people. They're not educating their young people. And therefore, we need to equip our mosques and our community centres with the people that have the knowledge to transfer to young people. Okay. Islam was my empowerment. Before I understood what Islam was, I used to see Islam as culture. So, and then for that reason, I resented it, because I felt that, I don't understand this religion of mine. Why does it allow this and that, not that? And there's many young people who also have that same confusion, where they are told that this is religion, when in actual fact it's culture that's being followed over and beyond religion, to the point where religion is negligible. So we need to educate our communities, because Islam and
I'm sure that's what you did. I mean, you read through it.
Yeah, absolutely. I learned about what my rights were as a woman. I learned about how the Prophet, peace be upon him, treated other women. And so I don't need to look at other people, other men, other women. I know what the role model is. I know who the role model is. And that's why every person needs to know who the role model is. And also around the Prophet, peace be upon him, were so many incredibly strong women, and they are seen as our mothers in our faith, and they're given so much esteem. And yet the strengths of those women, when they are projected in women of our time and day and age, are seen as something wrong.
So
they're a bit too assertive.
Would you blame these scholars for not promoting this version of Islam, rather than sticking to one sort of very basic, that you have to read Salah, you have to do this.
I don't want to. I've come across some sheikhs that have been amazing. So I don't want to put them all in one bag. But I'm just talking from my experience growing up. And the mosque that I know in my local area, I can't speak nationally or internationally, but on a local level, no, mosques have not done, and it's disappointing. It's very disappointing, and some of them are wrong, and
I think these issues need to be addressed in the mosques as well. There should be workshops in the mosques where people can come, and rather than we just using it as a place of worship, there should be a healthy debate involving those intellectual.
But that's what mosques were. Mosques were not just where you went 5 times a day to pray. Mosques were community centres, they were libraries, they were schools, they were hospitals.
To propagate this vision of yours, then there will be so many people who will say, no, you can't just do anything in the mosque other than praying.
No, I don't think they would. I think what we have is a lack of willingness and manpower to build up our mosques. And we also have committee members and people who run mosques who have a very strong hold on it and don't allow for new voices and a difference of opinion. And unfortunately, rather than focusing on social issues, we tend to focus on differences between sectarian differences, you know, Sunni Shia, Deobandi, Barelvi, Salafi, and you know, and all these different things. We focus on things that are very minor. And they are distractions, and they do say that shaitan distracts us through minor
rather than targeting these core issues. Okay.
And where we are right now, we have so many social issues that are affecting the harmony of our families and breaking the units of our families. And Islam, the central point of Islam is family unit. If you have a family unit, you have good faith. If you don't, then faith falls apart. And if we don't focus on that, then we are going to have these issues.
Having said that, actually, I would like to say all mosques, again, we're putting them in a bag. There have been a few that, not a lot, 1 or 2 that have wanted to talk about these issues, but some of them need guidance, or some of them need people to go in and say, how should we deliver the khutbah? Then this is something we've not dealt with. So how do we bring it up? How do we...
and how would you target those people, especially who cannot even speak the languages those scholars are speaking? For example, in the case of Pakistani communities, they speak Urdu, and youngsters, they really do not sort of follow.
So, yeah.
It is very difficult, but I think times are changing.
And they have a very traditional way of thinking as well to propagate or deliver their khutbahs.
I think it depends on the mosque, because remember, you can have mosques that hold 2,000 people in congregation, then you have a mosque which is someone's front room or a house that's been converted. So you have to look at the size and what their capacity is. The larger mosques and the much more established mosques are slowly starting to change.
I mean, just give us your final thoughts that one, if these cases like Shafila's, Banaz, and these tragic, if they're about to happen in our community, how can we stop them? With you, Sophia.
That not stay silent. Another thing is, even with domestic violence cases, when we know it's going on in our neighborhood, we don't tend to get involved. I think we're still at that level. How I think as 40, 60 years ago, Western world was, where you do not interfere in the private sphere. So I think we're there now, and in order to emancipate, you have to encourage those victims to come out and show the support. Don't gang up and gossip about her or say, oh, she's brought dishonor. Say we support you and give her that helping hand, that we're here to support you and it's right what you're doing. I think it will help victims to come out a bit more.
Okay, your final thoughts.
I think the message to the victims would be that their happiness is the most important thing for them. And no matter how much they sacrifice, ultimately they will gain nothing from that sacrifice if it makes them absolutely miserable. So they have to ensure that they protect themselves from a lifelong of misery. To the parents, what I would say is, please, if you love your children, understand that you cannot force them into loving another person. You develop that love over years. You know, it was something that came to you because of your relationship. Now, if there's no love between your child and another person, no matter how much you try, how much money you throw at them, how much you counsel them, it will not come. So only encourage.
The marriage itself is an institution.
Absolutely,
that has
and value marriage for its longevity, not for what somebody down the road says. It's a lot more than that. And to the community, I'd say, it's time to be responsible. It's time to look after your own, and to not be neglectful to your duty, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask, how did you look after the people who were not able to speak up for themselves?
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, and good to have you here. Viewers, I would like to conclude today's episode with this notion from a book. Ayatollah Murtada Mutahhari in Iran, he published a book in 1980 regarding the rights of women in Islam, and he narrates in its chapter 3 the famous story, the Holy Prophet himself gave away his daughter in marriage, but he never deprived her, the Lady of Light, Bibi Fatima Salamullah alayhi. When Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam presented himself to the Holy Prophet to ask for the hand of Bibi Fatima Zahra Salamullah alayhi, the Holy Prophet said, several persons have come to me to ask for the hand of Zahra. The Holy Prophet went to his daughter and put the matter before her. Bibi Fatima Salamullah alayhi did not turn her face away in disapproval this time, and by keeping silent and undisturbed, expressed her consent. The Holy Prophet came away from Bibi Zahra's and recited Takbir. Viewers, let's make a pledge. There are no more tragic incidents like the one of Shafila, who was a gift of God to her parents, family and friends. But in attempt to play happy families, her own parents suffocated her and her wishes with a plastic bag. With these prayers, as always, गम हमको न देख सिवाय गम शब्बीर, शब्बीर का गम बांट रहा है तो इधर दे. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad.